We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that He died for our sins, to restore all things in right relationship with the King. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that all things are good, that what God says in His Word is true, and that He meant every word. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe the future's open, that God is free and He's Lord of the possibilities. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Well, hello and welcome to the Tattered Bible Podcast, where we study to show ourselves approved. And here and today we are discussing Leviticus. We're doing an overview of Leviticus, part 1 of 4. Now, I want to do something before I introduce our very dapper guest, Paul Vendredi. I want to just go over some preliminaries. So first, like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you do that on every video. And if you go to our video, this is the second episode, because if I go to the first episode, it will play during the stream and will have an echo. So this is the first episode, and if you go to the second episode, but it's the same on the first one. If you go to the bottom of all my videos, there's this link tree here, and I'm not going to click it because I already have it clicked. Here are resources of mine. I'm just going to run through this very quickly. Some YouTubers I enjoy or endorse, some good churches, and some good books. If you go to the bottom of this episode, it has both Paul Vendredi and his other channel added. So you can go to Paul Vendredi and like, share, and subscribe there. Watch every video. Go to Theological Archive. Like, share, and subscribe there. Watch every video. Also, I don't have it pulled up, but his website. Make sure you go to the website. In fact, if you get a little bit of money, go and purchase his podcast series. It is excellent. You will really enjoy it. And without further ado, welcome, Paul Vendredi.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for pointing people to the website and to the YouTube channels. I gotta say, though, watching that intro, I'm going to assume that all of your viewers are speed readers. I mean, that was a lot of verses flying by at the speed of light.
Yeah, I don't know what else to fill the to fill the video with. I fill it with verses. Yeah, Church Split says, "What's up, guys?" And he says, "Paul's work is unparalleled." Thank you, Will, for watching tonight. He's watching on X, by the way. Wait a minute. I want to do one more thing. Where is it? Oh, it's on a different tab. Okay, now you can get started whenever you like.
Well, I don't know if I want to start. I'm outraged because in that intro, it looked like your name was bigger than mine. Homie, don't play that game, shipmate.
I didn't do it on purpose. I promise. I'll fix it on the next one.
All right. Well, shall we launch into our topic?
Yes, we should.
Yeah.
So where are we starting today, Paul?
Well, we should start with some words about our subject matter, which is the book of Leviticus, the third book in the Bible. Economists refer to their discipline as the dismal science. And in my opinion, I think we students of the Bible should refer to Leviticus as the dismal book, because its reputation is dismal beyond belief. What usually happens is, every January 1st, people get it in their heads that they want to read through the Bible. So they ambitiously launch into their 4-chapter-a-day reading of the Bible. They cruise through Genesis, they cruise through Exodus, then they hit Leviticus and get completely bogged down. In some cases, these readers just abandon the project altogether and stop reading the Bible. So what people have had to do who put together these lists of how to read through the Bible in a year is what they usually do is split up the book of Leviticus, interspersing it with books from elsewhere in the Bible because it's such a difficult and confusing read. And my experience with the book is not too far off from that either, because when I was 14 years old, I decided that I was going to read through the Bible cover to cover for the first time, Genesis to Revelation. I pulled my mom's Schofield Reference Bible off the shelf and started reading. As happens with everyone else, I cruised through Genesis and Exodus because they're loaded with these really interesting narratives. And when I hit the book of Leviticus, I just said, what in the name of Hades am I reading? I had no idea what it meant. Even when I read all the footnotes in that Schofield Reference Bible and the intro in before the book, by the way, the intro is all dispensationalist. Not that I knew that at age 14, but the Schofield Reference Bible is straight through dispensationalist theology in its footnotes. If people don't know that, they read the footnotes and assume that this is just what the Bible teaches. That's another topic. I'm just saying that that's what the Schofield Referenced Bible is about. Well, I've read through the Bible many more times since age 14. As a matter of fact, this year, 2024, I read through the book of Leviticus 30 times. When you read through a book 30 times, all of the problems therewith really jump off the page. And Jacob, before we go further, could we mute the music? It's getting a little distracting.
You want to mute the music? If it's a distraction, I will mute it. I told you that. I told you. Okay.
All right.
That is perfectly fine. I just know my audience enjoyed it the other day, and if it's a distraction to you, we'll get rid of it.
Yeah. All right. So we talked about the problems. I read through Leviticus 30 times. We already knew that this book is replete with difficulties. One of the biggest difficulties we have is that the book, well, let's just say the contents of the book are very obviously not in their original intended order. Everything is jumbled in there. This is something, by the way, I'm not being a liberal by saying that. If you look at the MacArthur Study Bible, whether you look at edition number 1 or edition number 2, in Leviticus, those study Bibles have a chart, and it shows you where all of the sacrifices are listed, and they are dispersed throughout the whole book. There's an especial dispersion in chapters 6 and 7. I like to refer to chapters 6 and 7 as the sacrificial junk drawer. What I suspect happened with the book of Leviticus is in 586 BC, when the Babylonians sacked the temple. Not only did they destroy the temple and the Ark of the Covenant, but they probably also burned every one or most of the copies of Leviticus. So those scrolls went up in smoke. And when the Hebrews returned from captivity in Babylon, they had to rebuild this from scraps that they probably still had, that they had preserved, and also from the memories of what few priests were still living. Because remember, a priest begins his career at age 30, and the Babylonian exile lasted for 70 years. So we're talking about people who would be probably 100 years old. So you're getting these out of the memories if you actually have anyone who's 100 years old. And when I first heard, the first time I read Josephus 25 years ago, he said something to this effect. He said that the Old Testament was basically destroyed and that Ezra recreated the whole thing. When I first read that, I just yelled, "That's liberal!" Of course, I'm using an anachronistic term, a Jew from the first century. It's not applicable to say conservative or liberal. But at that point in my career, I had the apologetics industrial complex in my heart and soul. I was a new convert to Eastern Orthodoxy from Protestantism. I had been an adamant Protestant apologist. And what I did at that point, becoming Orthodox, I simply took the Protestant apologetics and wrapped it up with a little bit of Byzantine wrapping paper. But having read through Leviticus 30 times this year, I'm going to say it looks an awful lot like Josephus was right. This book has been reconstructed, and it's been reconstructed in a rather sloppy and haphazard manner. For example, if you look at chapter 18 starts out with the commandment against adultery and then gives you a very elaborated take on it. Basically, it tells you that adultery also comprises various forms of incest, also homosexuality and bestiality. So it names what the problem, what the sexual misconduct is, but it doesn't tell you anything more than that. It doesn't tell you if it has to be punished, and it doesn't tell you how it should be punished. Then when we move to chapter 19, it goes on to the commandments about honoring one's parents and honoring the Sabbath. Then all of a sudden, you have a pretty lengthy digression on peace offerings. Well, the peace offerings were described in chapter 3. Why are they suddenly coming up again in chapter 19? And then when you go to chapter 20, it picks up with adultery again. And it gives you all of the punishments that go with the infractions that were named 2 chapters prior. Everything is blatantly out of order. I had mentioned the sacrificial junk drawers of chapters 6 and 7. What we have in Leviticus is chapters 1 through 7 concern the sacrifices. And then besprint through the rest of the book, you have these random references to those sacrifices that probably belong in those original chapters. The most blatant instance of this is chapter 27. Chapter 27 describes a type of offering that's called in anthropology and history of religion, a votive offering. So in the early chapters, you have whole burnt offerings, partial burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and trespass offerings. It would make sense also to include votive offerings, since that's yet another type of offering that's being described. The second problem is a little more disturbing, and this may be a real reason why so many people just throw up their hands in despair when they read Leviticus. There are even hardcore Christians who love the New Testament, and they know the New Testament makes reference to Leviticus. For example, Matthew 1:44, where Jesus sends a healed leper to offer the sacrifice that's enumerated in Leviticus 14. Yet these readers are still paralyzed with fear when it comes to the Pentateuch, and especially Leviticus. Again, Leviticus is the dismal book. And what is more, now I interrupted myself, what is far more troubling than the disorder that we see in Leviticus is that the ceremonies and sacrifices that God mandates to be done in this book are very obviously pagan and even occultic in origin. So when you're looking at a whole burnt offering, when you're looking at a partial burnt offering, and when you're looking at things like trespass offerings and things that are called oblations, all of these things have analogs in the pagan religions that came before the Old Testament. Now, that's going to send the apologetics industrial complex into a furor because they believe that the Bible, I'm stereotyping here, but you're going to get my point. The Bible dropped out of heaven, whole and entire. It has no analogs anywhere in the ancient Near East, no analogs anywhere in previous religions, et cetera, which, by the way, they don't even believe. Because if you read Protestant apologists like Paul Copan in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? He is constantly making reference to ancient Near Eastern practice, ancient Near Eastern custom, ancient Near Eastern religion. And he's saying, well, you know, this thing that we find utterly abominable, that's just God accommodating himself to the milieu in which the Hebrews found themselves. Well, it sounds bad, but that's the only answer you can give to why you have these pagan sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. You also have a problem, and this is troubling to apologists, because all of these things are done away with, not just in the New Testament. Some of what's in Leviticus is done away as soon as you get to Deuteronomy. And moreover, it's not only done away with, there are occasions where it's mocked, because some of these sacrifices are referred to as food offerings. It says that it's a sweet savor in the nose of your God. It's anthropomorphizing God. God is obviously allowing the Hebrews to think that they are feeding him when in fact they are doing no such thing. For example, it says in Psalm 50, the world is mine and the fullness thereof. If I were hungry, I would not tell thee. Obviously, God doesn't need anything. Obviously, God is not a physical being that needs food or even wants to eat food. When you get to the story of Elijah and the false prophets, which we have in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah mocks the false prophets for thinking that they have a God who can be fed, a God who eats and sleeps and does other bodily processes. And then there's also a deuterocanonical book in the Old Testament called Bel and the Dragon. In certain Bibles, it's actually included in the book of Daniel. That entire book mocks the idea that a statue or a god can eat. And Daniel is the protagonist in the story. So we have a big problem here. You've got these occultic practices and these pagan practices. The answer that the church fathers had is very similar to what Paul Copan said. If you look at 4th century church fathers like Athanasius or Gregory of Nazianzus, both of these guys tell you that God was accommodating these people as if they are children, and then as they get older, he gradually allows them to divest themselves of these pagan notions. So here's what happens. They leave Egypt in Exodus chapter 12. Israelite religion starts getting revealed to Israel little by little by God through Moses, including the 10 Commandments. And then you come to an incident where Moses is on the mountain, the people get scared, and they revert to their original Egyptian paganism in which they had been immersed for 400 years. They build themselves a statue of the Apis bull. That's the golden calf incident. So there's a huge incident where the Levites, who did not apostatize, kill all of the people who went apostate. As a reward for that, God establishes the Levitical priesthood. Prior to that, there had been an Aaronic priesthood and a priesthood of all believers. That's elaborated in Exodus 19.
Yeah.
As you move forward, you come to this book called Leviticus, which, according to some scholars, actually was written at about the time the narrative that's happening in Numbers chapter 8 is occurring. Now, what's going on is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of some others, the book of Leviticus is the punishment for the golden calf incident. But it's more than just a punishment. It's also a helpful corrective. So when the Israelites came out of Egypt, God allowed them to have an Israelite, this is pre-golden calf. He allowed them to have a religion that had some resonances of Egyptian religion in it, so that they wouldn't feel like they were doing something totally new and amazing. For example, the Ark of the Covenant and the altar of incense look very much like an Egyptian bark shrine, a B-A-R-Q-E. This is a boat shrine. It's a shrine that's shaped like a boat. The priests in Egypt during Jubilee periods and other festivals put the statue of the god inside the bark shrine, and they paraded it through towns, and everybody had a big feast and a big party. It was a big blowout and a lot of fun for everybody. So the Israelites have spent 400 years immersed in this civilization. They have seen these things. The Israelites are basically just another species of pagan Egyptian. So when God brings them out, he doesn't change everything totally. Then you have the golden calf incident. Prior to the golden calf, you have what I call merciful accommodation of pagan religion. After the golden calf, you get Leviticus, which is a kind of punitive, accommodation. So you go from merciful accommodation pre-golden calf to punitive accommodation post-golden calf. Now just think about this. In Mark 1:44, Christ heals a leper, and he says, "See thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing those things which Moses commanded for a testimony unto them." That's Mark 1:44. He's pointing to Leviticus chapter 14. In Leviticus chapter 14, it tells us that when a man has been cleansed from leprosy, he has to approach the priest. And there is a long series of rituals stretching out over a number of days that this man who has been cleansed of leprosy has to undergo. The first part of this ritual involves him bringing 2 birds to the priest. The priest kills one of the birds, pours out the blood, rolls the living bird in the blood, and lets the living bird flit away across the landscape. So it escapes and one bird is killed. The priest then takes that bird blood and then smears it onto the leper. After that, there's a whole series of things. The leper has to shave his hair and stay outside of the camp for 7 days. He gets examined again, after which he has to shave all his body hair yet again. And then he has to come back and offer yet more animals in sacrifice and more grain. So he kills a multitude of animals and has to go endure a long, several day long process. This is what Hebrew lepers, Israelite lepers, had to do when they were healed. Now, if we go to 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 10 and surrounding context, we have the story of Elisha and Naaman. Naaman is a non-Israelite. He's a Syrian and he's a leper. His maidservant tells him that there is a prophet in Israel who can heal him. So he goes to Elisha's house, and it tells us in 1 Kings 5:10, and Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, "Go and bathe in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean." That's all he has to do. He bathes in Jordan 7 times, and he's cleansed of his leprosy. After that, he approaches Elisha again. Elisha does not tell him to go to a priest and kill birds, lambs, offer up grain to be burned, shave off all his body hair, etc. He doesn't have to do any of that. Elisha just says to him, go in peace.
Yes.
Obviously, what is happening in Leviticus is a punitive type of accommodation. God is saying, you want all this foldy roll from Egyptian religion? You got it. I'll give you just enough to quench your thirst for it, but not enough that you'll go off into full-blown paganism by practicing it. Now, I want us to stop and think, too. I talked about the problem of occultism and paganism. Let's take this bird sacrifice that I just described. Let's say that you have a troubled 15-year-old son. Okay? One day, your son and the kid next door take your 2 family parakeets. Then they put your old Judas Priest LP onto the turntable and play it backwards. Then they take these parakeets down into your basement. The kid next door kills one of the parakeets, smears its blood all over a bowl, then rolls the live parakeet in the bowl and lets it go. And the parakeet flits up the stairs and goes back into the house to fly around. Then the kid next door wipes all that blood onto your 15-year-old son, and your 15-year-old son wipes the blood onto him. Now, you happen to come home right at the end of this ceremony. You see this loose parakeet covered in blood flying around in your living room. Then you see that the Judas Priest record is up on the turntable. You're like, uh-oh. Then you go downstairs and you see these kids smeared in blood. Do you assume that these are good Christian boys who are trying to worship Jesus? Or do you assume that these boys have become interested in Satanism and are now experimenting with it? It's the latter, of course. Yeah. So when people say, oh, Jesus, he's all of these animal sacrifices from the Old Testament. Really? Really? You want to defend that in detail? Sorry, you're going to have a lot of problems. All you have to do is go back and find all of those old Talk Back with Bob Larson episodes from the 80s and 90s. This was back in an era when heavy metal was popular, and the heavy metal bands always affected this kind of pseudo-satanic ethos. And all the kids who were influenced by those bands wanted to impersonate that ethos. So you always got these calls to Talk Back with Bob Larson. Oh yeah, my kid has he killed this neighborhood cat, or I found, or, you go to Miami where they have a big Santeria community. You find these butchered animals dumped into the canals anytime there's a Santeria festival. Again, are we going to assume this is the worship of Yahweh? No. We assume it's voodoo. We assume it's Umbanda, Macumba, Santeria, or self-styled Satanism. We do not assume that it's any kind of biblical religion.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. God doesn't need blood in order to be satiated, right? There's nothing that the blood sacrifice does to him. The blood sacrifice is about us, and God has abolished that blood sacrifice with his son. And so, just like I was talking about last night in my stream, that I did last night, God doesn't, God isn't a wrathful, vengeful deity that needs his bloodlust satiated and all this. God is good. He is always good. Even when he's passing judgment, he's good. Because for God to cease to be good, he would have to cease to be God.
Jacob, you say that God does not need blood sacrifice. Not only does he not need blood sacrifice, God doesn't need anything. The Apostle Paul in the book of Acts says God has no need of anything and does not dwell in temples made with human hands. And, pardon me, I had to clear my throat. That's another issue with Leviticus, is it makes a lot of hay out of sacred space and ceremonial cleanness. These are two things that the New Testament explicitly tells you mean nothing.
Yeah.
God does not dwell in temples made with human hands. The reason why you have a tabernacle that has a tent in the center, and then inside the tent you have yet another chamber called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant reposes, is again the merciful accommodation of pre-Golden Calf Israelite religion. They came from an Egyptian religion where the statue of the god was hidden away in the dark recesses at the back of the temple. And when you went into the temple, which you could not do as a layperson in ancient Egypt, only the priests could. The lay people had a very faint knowledge of what their religion were. They only saw it on festival days, and the priests made no effort to explain it to them.
Yeah.
So the common Egyptian never saw this. They just knew that there was a statue in the recesses of the temple, and the priests brought that statue out a couple times a year and paraded around it in the bark shrine. So God allowed the Hebrews to have something like that. So they have an Ark of the Covenant, which has a statue on it. It's not a statue of God, it's a statue of two cherubim. And in the Bible, angels act on behalf of God. That's what the symbolism is. These angels are on this and then it's put away into the recesses of the temple, or excuse me, of the tabernacle, as if it's an Egyptian shrine. And then what happens when it needs to come out is the Levites, post-Golden Calf, they walk into the holy place, which is the exterior tent. Then they turn backwards. They take the veil and they drop it over their backs onto the Ark of the Covenant. Once the veil covering the Holy of the Holies is over the Ark of the Covenant, then they take it out of the tabernacle and they parade it in front of the people. And you'll notice that when you read books like Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, the people treat this as if it's a mobile oracle. And that's how it's treated in 1 Samuel. That is exactly the way ancient Egyptians treated the mobile shrines. This is an accommodation. There's a book I really love called The 48 Laws of Power. I think it's rule number 45 tells us, always preach the need for change, but never change too much at once. It's as if God is observing this rule in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. He gives them a little bit of Israelite, or gives them a little bit of Egyptian religion to whet their appetite, to, ease them into, it's like a goldfish. You empty out half of its water and you pour in half new water. And then a little bit later on, you can pour out the water again and put in some more new water, but you don't put all the water in at once. You got to introduce the goldfish bit by bit. The Israelites are like the goldfish, if I can use this kind of silly simile. The Israelites are like the goldfish, and the water they're swimming in is their religion. God introduces little bits and pieces of the truth to them, and then slowly but surely subtracts falsehood from their religion. And again, this is Basil of Caesarea, this is Gregory of Nazianzus, this is Athanasius, this is a lot of 4th century church fathers saying this. It's not something I've just manufactured. This is what it is.
Yeah, and to my audience, to those of my audience that are not Orthodox or that aren't part of the anti-PSA crowd, some of you even may hold to a weak form of PSA. If you're doubting what he's saying here, think about this for a minute. Sacrifices aren't the only thing that is different in the true religion than it is in what is happening in Leviticus. Because in Leviticus and Exodus, well, partially in Exodus, but also in Leviticus and Numbers, I think a little bit in Deuteronomy, it talks about laws for slavery. And it talks about laws for, I can't remember what the other one was. But it talks about laws for slavery. And yet, one of the things that the early Christians did early on was, at least in their own homes, they abolished slavery for themselves. And eventually, as you get to the progression of Christianity throughout the ages, they abolished slavery altogether. And what you have with slavery is just like with the sacrifices. You have God So slavery around about them was different. You did have almost chattel slavery in other cultures. But God says you can't steal people from their homes. That's a death penalty offense. You can't kill your slave. That's a death penalty offense. If you knock out a tooth or put out an eye, you lose your slave. They have to go free. And slavery is for debt or for war crimes. It's not for it's not, the slaves weren't considered property in that sense.
Jacob, when we talk about things that are introduced and then things that are removed, that continued into the church age, according to a number of church fathers. I'm going to use an illustration here that you and many of your subscribers are going to have to ignore because it involves the Trinity. But according to Basil of Caesarea, who is one of the great church fathers of the 4th century, the Old Testament introduced us to the Father and only very darkly hinted about a Son. Then when we got to the New Testament, we were introduced to the Son, but the text only very darkly hinted about the Holy Ghost. And Basil of Caesarea says that it was up to the church age, the age in which he was living, to come up with the theology of the Holy Ghost. So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, according to these Trinitarian fathers, was introduced step by step. It was not introduced all at once. This is not alien to anyone who's a parent either. When we send our kids to elementary school, the math teacher tells them with infallible certitude that they cannot subtract a larger number from a smaller number. Yet when the kid goes to 7th grade and starts taking pre-algebra, he gets introduced to integers. Suddenly you learn about negative numbers, and now you find out that you actually can subtract a larger number from a smaller number. But we don't tell that to the elementary school kids because it's too conceptually confusing at that age and would quite possibly derail their mathematics studies from that point forward. Jacob, I'm going to share something that I have on the screen here. It is along these lines as well. Give me just a moment. You can keep talking.
I don't know.
Well, let me give this a shot.
I have to put it on the screen though.
All right, there we go. So what we're looking at is, this is a fundraising letter that I got from an organization called the Center for Arizona Policy. The Center for Arizona Policy is composed of conservative Christians who lobby the state capitol on behalf of family-friendly policies. It's a great organization, and I'm on their mailing list, both for emails and for snail mails. In this snail mail, this is what they wrote on page 2, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Quote, "To build a culture of life, we must overcome 50 years of people living with legal abortion and all that has done to the and and minds of the people. The passage of Proposition 139 made it tragically clear that Arizona is not a pro-life state. Not yet. For abortion to become truly unthinkable, we must begin again to rebuild a pro-life culture, changing hearts and educating minds about the sanctity of human life." End quote. All right, do you see why I read that?
Yes, it's very much applicable to Leviticus.
Yeah, so what Kathy Herod, the president of Center for Arizona Policy, who wrote this letter, at least her name's on the bottom of it, she's telling us that we have been in a Roe versus Wade culture for more than 50 years. That 50 years has inured us to abortion. We've become used to abortion when in fact we probably should not be used to it. Now, for example, I'm old enough to remember when Slick Willie ran for president in 1992. Slick Willie was married to a harridan named Hillary Rodham Clinton. Hillary Rodham Clinton in the 1990s was trying to reassure conservative voters who didn't like her. Hey, look, I'm not a big abortion person. I want abortion to be legal, rare, and safe. She kept harping on that. Yeah, safe, rare, and legal, whatever the three-word thing was. Safe, rare, and legal. That was her mantra, okay? This year, 2024, when we had the presidential campaign between Camel Face Harris and El Trumpo, the mantra was, abortion is our religion. We love abortion. We want as much abortion as there can be. Not only that, they
shout your abortion.
Exactly. They had an abortion clinic on wheels at the Democrat convention. They had turned abortion into a sacrament. Now, again, 1992, that's just a little over 30 years ago.
Yeah.
When Hillary Clinton
was the year before I was born.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton had to say, hey, we just want abortion to be rare. It's only for rare instances. That changed over the span of years. That's when you legalize things like abortion, that's what happens to people. They become inured to it. And that is exactly what happened to Israel. We have been in the midst of a Roe versus Wade pro-abortion culture for 50 years. Israel was in pagan Egypt for 400 years. When they left Egypt, I guarantee you, these people were just another species of pagan Egyptian. God did not have a lot to work with there. Sorry to say it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, they weren't the same people coming out that they were going in.
All right. I have finished those remarks. I want to, if you have no objection now, I'm just going to move on to, I think we're looking at chapters 1 through 7. Is that correct?
Yes. That is correct.
Good.
And that is what I have up here. Chapter 1. Is it big enough?
That
Can everyone in the audience see it?
We are not going to be reading the text, and we are certainly not going to be doing a close reading. So having it up there is a bonus, but we don't really need it, because what I'm going to do, as the title of the show says, is this is just an overview. So what I'm going to do is just go through the chapters and very quickly, section by section, tell you what's happening in the section and maybe offer a little commentary here and there. And if you want to slow it down, you can stop me and offer your own insights anytime you want. We're beginning with chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. And it tells us that God speaks to Moses out of the tabernacle. The tabernacle is what we were describing earlier, that later gets disassembled and it's built into an actual temple at the time of Solomon. We talked about Egyptian accommodation. The Egyptian accommodation seems to have continued even from the time that you go from a tabernacle to a temple, which is a span of several hundred years, because the Egyptian temples had a pylon in front of them. That is to say, it had these two big pillars. Well, what did Solomon put in front of the doors of the temple? He put two pillars. The pillars were named Jachin and Boaz. The Masonic Lodge has a field day with those two pillars. All right, back to what we're talking about here in Leviticus, chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. The sacrifice that is established, I'm starting a little far into the text. It's chapters 1, verses 1 through 9. We have the burnt offerings. There are two types of burnt offerings in Leviticus. There's the whole burnt offering, W-H-O-L-E, whole offering. In other words, entire burnt offering. And then you have the partial burnt offerings. The partial burnt offerings are usually things like produce or grain. When we say whole burnt offering, that gives us the idea that the animal is completely burned up. The Hebrew word is holocaust, or that's the Greek word, holocaust. So the animal is completely burned. But as I said, Leviticus is completely disordered. There are portions of the later chapters of Leviticus that recapitulate the burnt offering discussion, and they tell you that the priest actually keeps the hide of the animal. So that what happens is actually the animal is killed, and then it's skinned, and then it's burned, and then the priests are allowed to have the skin. Apparently, a lot of these Aaronites, a lot of the priests in the Aaronic order were tanners. They probably weren't actual priests. They probably ran tanning shops that made leather goods. All right. So the first whole burnt offering, and again, whole should be in quotation marks, is cattle.
Yeah.
The cattle are the only one of the burnt offerings that are said to make atonement. So if you look through that chapter, in fact, I'm going to whip out my King James here. It says in verse 4 that it makes atonement. You can see it right there in verse 4.
Yeah.
It shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Be careful. That word atonement should be in quotation marks. In fact, anytime you see the word atonement in the book of Leviticus, you should put it in quotation marks, because the hermeneutic rule is the Old Testament is always to be interpreted in the light of the New. And the New Testament tells us in Hebrews 10:4, the blood of bulls and goats does not make atonement. Now, either we have a contradiction in the Bible, or the Old Testament has to be understood to mean that this is atonement in quotation marks. God is allowing the Hebrews to think that they're making atonement, just as they would placate a pagan god in order to keep them from worse paganism. Exactly as he allows them to think that they are feeding him, that he is an anthropomorphic physical being with a nose that can smell the savor of these burnt offerings. Moving on, we have chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. The next
Give me a minute, Paul, give me a minute. You can keep talking. I need to do something real quick.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to stay here on mute until you get back, just in case you miss something. All right, I'm coming back. I'm not sure when Jacob Seiler's here, so I'll just address this to the subscribers and the viewers. There's our man. Are you back? You are on mute, sir.
Yes, I'm back. I just had to take her outside.
Her being your dog.
Yes, my dog.
We are in chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. We're in the burnt offerings again. We're moving down now. Instead of cattle, we're offering sheep and goats. And for all those city slick and seminary elitists, be advised that sheep and goats are not the same animal. Those are two different
genera. They are not the same animal. As someone that has dealt with sheep, goats, and cows before, none of them are the same.
Yeah.
Cows want to stay away from you. Goats will antagonize you, and sheep are like puppy dogs. None of these animals are the same.
They're not the same. Enough said on that. All right, the sheep and the goats have to be male, as does the cattle. So when we're talking about burnt offerings, you cannot bring a ewe for a sheep. You have to bring a ram, presumably a castrated ram or a young male lamb. Excuse me for one moment. What's interesting about this passage, verses 10 through 13, is that Moses, the author of Leviticus, describes the altar as being wood burning. That's really interesting because throughout the book of Leviticus, it's described as a wood burning altar. The only place where it is not described as such is in Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement passage. There, it's described as a coal-burning altar. When we get to Leviticus 16, I'll suggest some possible reasons why we have that seeming contradiction, but let's move on. We're going to chapter 1, verses 14 through 17, more burnt offerings. This time we're offering birds. When they offered cattle, sheep, and goats, it had to be male. In other words, you had to offer a bull, a ram, or a buck. You couldn't offer a cow or a ewe or a nanny. you had to offer up the male of the species. With the birds, it does not tell you what sex they are, presumably because these are small birds and it's really difficult to determine the sex of them anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, now we move from the whole burnt offerings into the partial burnt offerings. And this starts in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. The first of those partial burnt offerings is just granular flour. In other words, this is just the ground up wheat, the ground up barley, whatever the grain happens to be. You've ground it up. You have not baked it or fried it into any shape. It's just loose flour. So that loose flour is burned on the altar. It's partially burned. A portion of it is burned. The remaining portion is given to the priests, and they can have that as their food. Moving on to verses 4 through 10, we have another partial burnt offering. This is where you're not giving just loose flour. In this case, you're giving the flour and it's been baked or fried into some kind of form, usually into the form of a cake. And you get 3 different types there. And this is where the first time where any kind of offering is referred to in the King James Bible as an oblation. An oblation is a holy gift. All right? So what does that mean? That means that these burnt offerings that have been described in chapters 1 and 2 are not mandatory offerings. These are the whole burnt offerings are offerings that you can bring if you just want to give thanksgiving to God. You still have this pagan mindset that God is good and, you know, or he's done something for you, so you got to repay him. God accommodates that. These grain offerings are the same idea. They're called an oblation, and it's a much cheaper sacrifice than one of the animal sacrifices. Chapter 2, verse 11, we're still in the grain offerings. The passage forbids the offerer to offer the offering with leaven or honey. The reasons behind that are pretty obscure, but it may have something to do with the fact that ancient peoples thought that leaven and honey were associated with decay. So they weren't allowed to bring that with their offerings. Moving down to verses 12 through 16, we have yet more partial burnt offerings. This time it's the burnt offerings of produce. Yes, the palm of your hand was very attractive, Jacob. All right, so we're talking about, there you go again. Are you like showing me the hand? What are you doing there, Jacob?
No, I'm trying to figure out how to plug in my phone without shutting down my my Focusrite.
All right, why don't we leave that till after the show, because we're gonna blitz
Well,
through
it's
this
at
pretty
20%.
quick.
It's at 20%, but what I'll do if it dies is I'll just have my
Yeah.
avatar on.
Yeah, we're all addicted to our phones. I get it. I've got mine. It's in my favorite color, orange.
No, right now I'm mostly worried about the camera dying.
Yeah, okay. All right, let's roll. We'll get through this fast. Okay, chapter 2, verses 12 through 16. This is at another partial burnt offering. We're dealing with produce. This too is called an oblation. By the way, if you're using the King James Bible, it very confusingly refers to grain offerings and fruit and vegetable offerings as meat offerings. In early modern English, the word meat, M-E-A-T, could mean the flesh of an animal, but it could also just as easily mean any kind of food. So if you look at modern translations of the Bible, these partial burnt offerings are called food offerings, but they're called meat offerings in the KJV, which is massively confusing. Just a point of clarity there. Okay, now we're moving to chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. We come to something called a peace offering. And as we had with the whole burnt offerings of chapter 1, these are divided between cattle, sheep, and goats. In this chapter, there is no bird offered as a peace offering, whereas you could for a whole burnt offering. This one is only cattle, sheep, or goats. These are the ones that will get the attention of the Atonement school, because this is the first time it tells you that the offerer lays his hand onto the head of the offering. According to the Atonement school, this is where the offerer allegedly transfers his sins to the animal. And then you can kill the animal to satisfy God rather than allowing God to kill you. That's the thinking of Catholics, Protestants, the people that I call the Atonement school. That is not what's happening here. These peace offerings, when the person lays his hand on the head of the animal, he's designating this as the animal that he's going to sacrifice. In other words, he's designating the cow from the rest of the herd, the sheep from the rest of the flock, the goat from the rest of the trip, etc., etc. It's not until you get to chapter 16 that you hear anything about this being a transfer of sins. And even there, it's rather dubious to say it means what the Atonement school says it means. We'll deal with that more when we get to chapter 16, which is the chapter on the Day of Atonement. We're moving down to chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Chapter 4.
I wanted to make a quick comment. I know it's not the main point. Let's see. Okay, so the main point of this these episodes is about atonement. It's about, what Leviticus says about atonement and so on and so forth. But there's some people, and I want to talk about a side issue real quick. There's some people that think, and these are people that mostly think you should keep the dietary law, for example. There are people that think that the dietary law is there because it's healthier. That's why they think it's there. But we know that your body needs fat, that fat is brain food. And yet in this part here, it says you shall eat neither fat nor blood. Now the blood part is understandable, but it says you shall not eat fat.
The reason for that is these are not health regulations.
Yeah.
I've read that too.
Yeah,
this is especially a thing among vegetarians. Oh, look, these animals are so bad for you. No. The reason you're forbidden to eat blood is because blood was a divinatory tool in Egypt and in pagan societies in general. This is, so God says in Leviticus, you can go this far with your paganism, but no further. And the part that he would not let them go past was the blood part. You can't do the blood because that's a divinatory tool in ancient Egyptian religion. As far as the liver, which also has to be burned up in a number of these, the liver was also a divinatory tool. That was especially the case with the Romans. The Romans, they wouldn't go on any kind of campaign unless they had first cut open a chicken and had the priests examine the entrails, especially the liver, because the liver was understood in the ancient world to be the well of the blood. So what you have is they have to burn up the fat and the blood and the liver. That is not for health reasons. Everybody knows now that the propaganda of the food pyramid has been destroyed. Everybody knows that dietary fat is the most important macronutrient.
Yes.
For centuries, human beings prized the fat. I mentioned one of my favorite books, The 48 Laws of Power. I'm going to mention another of my favorite secular books. This one is called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price. Weston A. Price was a dentist in the 1930s. He went to all of these different civilizations that were still following their traditional dietary ways. So he looked at isolated Europeans, like people in these obscure Swiss cantons, people way up in the north of Scotland. He looked at Polynesians. He looked at Central Africans. He looked at African Aborigines. He looked at a number of these different races. And in every case where they followed their original diet, which was very heavy in meat and dietary fat and organ meats, these people had incredibly robust health. They lived in places where there were no dentists or no orthodontists, yet they had perfect teeth, no cavities, perfectly straight teeth, no need for orthodontia, and all of their wisdom teeth came in without crowding out their original teeth. When those civilizations went over to a modern diet, like is recommended by the US government for decades, the health of their children immediately deteriorated. Rotten teeth, crooked teeth, the wisdom teeth had to be extracted, bad eyesight, bad behavior too. This had an effect on people's behavior. Okay,
here's a friend of mine. He's asking a question. Isn't not eating blood go back to Genesis 9 and the purpose given there?
Let's pull up what he's talking about here.
Genesis 9. Let me pull up Genesis 9 too. 9 also, not...
It's probably talking about verse 5, chapter 9, verse 5. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And you shall be fruitful and multiply. Well, saying that it comes from that is a little bit of a stretch. I want to go back again to Weston Price. One of the racial groups that he looked at were the Central Africans. So these black Africans had a habit of piercing their cattle with an arrow, not killing the cow, but just piercing it with an arrow and then drinking the blood straight from the wound. And then they would cauterize the wound so the animal would stop bleeding. The Central Africans were one of the healthiest groups of people he looked at. Consumption of blood is actually good for you. I'm not going to give the names of any of these companies, but there are supplement companies aplenty that make blood supplements. They're made out of the blood of grass-fed cattle. Blood is good for you. Dietary fat is good for you. Liver is incredibly good for you. According to the Weston Price organization, beef liver from a grass-fed cow or bull is the healthiest thing you can possibly eat. And you know, I was born in the 70s, so I had to go through the 70s, 80s, and a large part of the 90s with the government telling us, if you eat animal organs, you will die. Don't ever eat animal organs. The government was lying. If you had done exactly the opposite of what the United States government has said to do, you would have perfect health. We would not have the metabolic syndrome crisis that we now have in this nation. We would not have the obesity crisis that we have in this nation. We would not have the depleted testosterone problem that we have in this nation. We would be a nation of healthy people. But the government poisoned us, and the government lied to us about nutrition. So when you're reading in the...
Hopefully RFK fixes that, by the way.
Yeah. So when you're looking at these things in the Bible and it's telling you not to eat blood, to burn up the fat and the liver, this has nothing to do with health and nutrition. This has to do with pagan religion. All right, let's move on. We're pretty far afield. I think we were in chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. These are sin offerings. Sin offerings are for inadvertent sin. If you do a sin purposely, there is no sacrifice in Leviticus for you. And this is referred to in the book of Hebrews, where it says, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin, but only a fury of fire, etc., etc. That's what it's referring to. The first sin offering, which is described in 1 through 12, is for the inadvertent sins of a priest. Then verses 13 through 21 are for the inadvertent sins of the whole congregation. Verses 22 through 26, the inadvertent sins of a ruler. And finally, verses 27 through 35 is the inadvertent sins of ordinary people. Okay, we go to chapter 5. We come to a new type of sacrifice. It's called a trespass offering. A trespass offering is designed to make a person ceremonially clean. If a person has become unclean ceremonially, he has to offer a trespass offering, and thereby he becomes admissible into the tabernacle yet again. Trespass offerings and the idea of ceremonial uncleanness are yet another fantasy of pagan religion. God allows people to have this fantasy because he's accommodating them mercifully, because they are basically at this point still pagan Egyptians. The ceremonial cleanliness is done away with by Christ. To eat or drink with unwashed hands is nothing, says Jesus. In other words, your ceremonial cleanliness or uncleanliness doesn't mean jack. What matters is what comes out of you. That applies also to the kosher rules that we get much later in Leviticus 15. The kosher rules directly tell you that this will defile you and make you inadmissible into the tabernacle. But what does Jesus say in Matthew chapter 15? If you go to verse 17 and the surrounding context, he says, what goes into a man is meaningless because it just goes into his alimentary canal and then is cast out into the sewer. What matters is what comes out of a man's heart. It is your character that matters. Your ceremonial cleanliness doesn't mean anything. This is all abolished, everything that's happening here in Leviticus. And people want to tell me that Jesus is fulfilling Leviticus? Come on. All right, let's go. Yeah, Joe Biden. Come on, man.
John,
right.
Come on, man.
All right, going into chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, the trespass offering of a lamb or a kid. Again, for the benefit of John MacArthur and all the other city slicking seminary elites out there, a lamb is a juvenile sheep. A kid is a juvenile goat. Let's get that straight. These are not the same animal. Okay. The next trespass offering is found in chapters 5, verses 7 through 10. And that is, my microphone is mysteriously moving on me. Give me just a moment. There we go. Okay. Okay, chapter 7 through 10. This is an offering of 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. This is what you have to offer if you become ceremonially unclean from accidentally touching a carcass or touching a corpse. Again, go to the New Testament. The widow of Nain, her son is being carried out on a bier, and Jesus touches the corpse. Is Jesus unclean?
No.
No.
Jesus can't be unclean.
So all of this is just pagan accommodation. Yet we're told that this is all some big thing, that this is manifesting the future of Christ. Okay, moving on to verses 11 through 13. Again, inadvertent ceremonial uncleanness from touching carcasses and so forth. This time you can offer 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. Right, now this is something I really want to talk about here. All right, I'm whipping out my KJV. We're going to go to chapter 5. We're not going to do a close reading, but I want to point something out. When we're in chapter 5, you start out with the sacrifice of cattle. Or, excuse me, you start out with the sacrifice of an animal from the herd or from the flock. In other words, a sheep or a goat. And it tells you that that makes atonement in quotation marks. Then it says, if you can't afford a sheep or a goat, then what you can do instead is to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and that will make atonement for you. Oh, but if you can't afford even 2 little birds, then here's what you do. Just bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. We'll burn that on the altar, and that'll make atonement for you. Every one of these sacrifices makes the same level of atonement. So even if we understand atonement there to mean reparation for a wrong or an injury, which is what John MacArthur and company say it means, then it tells you that it doesn't have to be blood. It can be by flour. Enough said. Moving on to chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, it's continuing the trespass offerings. Okay, and this is for a layman or an individual priest. Okay, now I want to say something about chapter 6 and 7. I described them earlier as the sacrificial junk drawers. When Ezra and company were putting Leviticus back together, they seem to have done it in great haste. And if they weren't sure where something sacrificial went, they seem to have dumped it into chapters 6 and 7. Because chapters 6 and 7 talk about burnt offerings, they talk about offerings for priestly ordination, sin offerings, trespass offerings and peace offerings. It also gives you some elements of the kosher law. This is just a junk drawer into which they dropped all the giblets of scroll that they didn't know where to place, right off the top of their head. So basically, chapters 6 and 7 goes through all of that. Basically, if we went through this chapter, I would have to tell you, well, this actually belongs after chapter 1, and this actually belongs after the partial burnt offerings of chapter 2. I think that would glaze everyone's eyes over. So I'm just going to leave it there. And we can adjourn and resume with chapter 8 the next time we get together.
Well, that was a good episode. We weren't able to deal with every issue, Seth, and I want to be kind to Seth because he's Church of Christ and he just believes differently than we do. But he's a good brother. We meet every once in a while, and he buys me a lemonade at Panera, and we sit and talk. He said he had to go. He enjoyed listening, but he was still on about eating of the blood. We didn't get to squash that all the way. The main point of this is not about the eating of the blood. But maybe if we do...
we're going to get to chapter 17. In fact, the most famous passage of Leviticus occurs in Leviticus 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. So maybe it's Leviticus 17:14, but that's definitely Leviticus 17:11 that I just quoted.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to address that when we get to that chapter.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee you this has nothing to do with health, nutrition, or anything else that most people have told you. This is a reference to pagan religion.
It's not my take. My take on stuff like the blood thing, part of it has to do with pagan religion, like you said. But the other part is that this is just to set the children of Israel apart. This is just to make them distinct from the people around about them. It doesn't, you know what I mean? It doesn't.
A peculiar people, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests.
That's what the ceremonial cleanness stuff is about. Yeah.
So a lot of what you have, by the way, this series, if it's watched by any Eastern Orthodox, they're going to be just as mad with me as any Protestant watching. And the reason for that is because Eastern Orthodox make a big deal out of sacred space. Sacred space is meaningless. Sacred space is a pagan concept that God allows people to think exists in the Old Testament. The New Testament disabuses us of that. God does not dwell in temples made with human hands. God is transcendent throughout the universe. God is everywhere. In fact, even works of systematic theology insist that God is omnipresent. Well, if God is dwelling in a temple made with human hands, then he's not omnipresent. He's locatable.
Okay, well, I'm going to close out now. So, thank you everyone for viewing. Please like, share, subscribe. Please go to paulvendredi.com, at Paul Vendredi on YouTube, at Christian Theological Archive to follow Paul more. Please look in my link tree. There's all kinds of goodies in there. And I'm going to close it out with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this ability to meet together. Thank you for the stream we had tonight. I hope it's insightful and helpful to everyone who watched. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved.